Welcome back. I'm Father John Cox at Dormition Orthodox Church here in Norfolk, Virginia. And we are slowly working our way through the Old Testament. As I was saying to everybody before I started the video, I didn't really intend to do an Old Testament survey, but really sort of to elucidate some themes from the Old Testament that are an important part of our theology and practice, and to show the sort of the unity of the Old and the New together. But I seem to have lingered a little longer than I initially intended to over the stories and over Genesis in general, and I don't think that's going to change much today. We might make our way through maybe from around Genesis 17 on through chapter 21. And as usual, if you have questions out there, feel free to type them in, and if I'm able, I'll do my best to get to them. Otherwise, I can certainly respond after the live broadcast is done. So, without further ado, let's jump right in to Genesis 17. Now, at the end of the last session, we got Hagar and Ishmael, and I said we'd be moving on a little bit this week, and we would get a new reiteration of the covenant, and that's what you're going to get in the very next chapter. So you get Hagar and Ishmael. They flee, they return. God blesses them, but says that Ishmael is going to be a man who is set against other men. God will bless him. He will protect them from Sarah's pettiness and her cruelty, but that this will not be the child of promise that God intended for Abraham. So we flip over to the next chapter, Genesis 17, and we get yet another iteration, a reiteration of the covenant. But here, for the first time, we get a version of it that involves some reciprocity. And perhaps the particular kind of reciprocity is not unrelated to what has just transpired. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty, walk before me faithfully and be blameless, and then I will make my covenant between you and me, and will greatly increase your numbers." Then Abraham falls face down before God, and he says, I will honor your covenant. And God says to him, "You must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you. And I will give you an everlasting possession, a land. You will have children, there will be many of the children." And then he tells him what the terms of the covenant will be. So, "I will make you the father of a great nation. I will give you a land and a place to be." A land where there's plenty of grass for a nomadic herder must sound just fantastic. And here is what you will give me. Here is the reciprocal dimension of the covenant. And Abraham says, yes, go on. What do you want? "I will give you cattle. I'll give you sheep. I want the foreskin of your penis." That is probably not at all what Abraham was expecting. And this is a point, this reciprocity of circumcision is something that I think has probably puzzled people for a long time. Why this particular... It isn't as though circumcision was unknown. It's not unknown in the ancient Near East. It's something that was done, at least in some cases, in other cultures. But why this? And not only just for Abraham, but this is an everlasting symbol of our covenant together. And you and your children and your descendants, anyone who does not do this, God says to Abram, is cut off from my covenant. I think perhaps God is being a little bit ironical right there. He does have a sense of humor. But why this particular way of expressing the covenant? It isn't even something that would be outwardly manifest, and it's not an outward sign of a covenant that would set you apart or anything like that. A couple of answers to this come to my mind, and the first is related to what has just taken place. Abraham and Sarah tried to effect the covenant using the normal human means of procreation. And of course, I don't mean to suggest that Isaac will not be conceived in the normal way, except that there is something abnormal about it, and that he is the child of the promise. Sarah is beyond childbearing years. There is something miraculous and divine in the conception of Isaac. So it is, in a sense, not normal, even though it is accomplished by the normal human manner of procreation, but not according to the normal human mode or impetus. So perhaps there is something of a commentary here by God on what Abraham tried to do, the way he tried to make the covenant come into effect, and the way God intends to make the covenant come into effect. Maybe that makes sense. The patristic commentary on the fall would have something sort of similar to say, which is that we become in the fall creatures of the passions, creatures of our desires, creatures of our impulses, who seek after our own satisfaction. And as is a familiar refrain in the Scripture, in the Old Testament, sexual desire and passion is a particularly potent one. One that seems to come up, and we're going to see it again in just a few minutes, though not strictly in the context of desire, but sort of, again, an overlapping theme. So I think perhaps an adequate, or at least one good answer to the question, why circumcision, is that God is undermining, in a very visceral way, the notion of how it is that he will establish his people. That these are not children of the body, children of the flesh, children of desire, children of the ordinary impulse of human relations, but that Abraham's promise will be fulfilled, and that Abraham's children will be children of the promise by the act of God, and not by human will. And there is then an overlap between then circumcision as a removing of the nerves around the penis that one would particularly associate with sexual desire and passion, with God, the way God intends to fulfill His promise, and then also in a perhaps more symbolically theological sense, with the dichotomy between being children of the flesh and children of the Spirit, of being in the sense of the orientation of the mode of existence. So perhaps that begins to get an explanation for why this particular symbol of the covenant. But God gives this covenant, makes this promise. Abraham agrees to it. And then you're going to see it again in the very next chapter, in a slightly different version. And this is the time when the three angels appear. Abram has his tent camped near the oak at Mamre. Three people come walking past his tent. He sees them there. And it is a sign of Abraham's greatness of spirit, his goodness, that he expresses hospitality as fully and eagerly as he does. Hospitality is the great testimony, especially in the Middle East, of one's well-breeding, of one's good manners, of one's being a good person. One shows hospitality. Correspondingly, to fail to show hospitality is considered not only a blight on one's character, but one's family, this kind of thing. So Abraham is camped there, and he sees these strangers walking by, and he runs out, and he calls to them, "Welcome to my land. Please come and sit down." He has chairs brought out for them, and then he runs to arrange for them a great feast. He runs out to his servant who is watching the herds, and he has him pick out one of the finest of his calves, and he says to him, "Slaughter it, and we're going to make them a feast." He runs and he has his wife begin to bake bread for them, and to milk a she-goat so that they have something to drink, and to prepare for them a great feast. And he washes their feet there by the oak where their chairs are, and he treats them with the fullness of hospitality and kindness and generosity. So then they're sitting there, and they have eaten this food, and then one of them says, "Where is your wife?" And he says, "She's there in the tent." And then this one says, "About this time next year, she will conceive and have a child." Sarah is kind of listening in from the door of the tent on their conversation, as I suppose one would do. It's probably stuffy in the tent anyway. And she laughs to herself. Now, in the previous chapter, Abram laughed when God said to him, you will have a son. Because he said, "I'm too old." Here Sarah laughs. She says, "I'm too old," to herself. She says, "I'm too old. I'm past childbearing years, and my husband, he's old too. You know, this is ridiculous. This is silly. How's this going to happen?" So then one of the angels, the one who spoke, said, "Why did your wife laugh?" And Abram turns and he looks back to the tent, and she looks out and says, "I didn't do it. I didn't laugh. It wasn't me." But the angel said, "Don't lie. You did too laugh." And then they got up to leave. And as they're going, there is in the text here, God deliberates with himself, or amongst himself, if you will. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" He has looked over toward the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which are a ways away from the land where Abraham is. Now, if you recall, it was recorded in the past that Sodom and Gomorrah were wicked, and that they were evil places. Lot has made his home there. Lot likes the city, likes the nightlife, enjoys having things to do, the cinema, whatnot. And so God says to himself, "Should I tell Abraham what I'm about to do?" And he says that yes, he will. And he says, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin is so grievous that I will go down and see if they have done anything that is as bad as what has been told to me. And if not, I will know it." So they turn to go toward Sodom. And then Abraham says, Lord, wait just a minute. Wait just a minute here. Don't go. If you please, just give me a second." And he knows his nephew and all of his family, his kin, are down there. And he says, and I love this. I love this whole exchange. I love it so much. He says, "Lord, hypothetically speaking, if I were to go down to the city, if I were to find there 50 righteous men, would you, for the sake of those 50 righteous men, refrain and not destroy the city?" And God says, For the sake of 50 righteous men, I would spare the city. Then Abraham speaks up again. He says, now that I've been so bold, Lord, and though I'm nothing but dust and ashes, if the number was less than 50, say 45, would you still hold back your anger? God says, if I find 45 there, I will not destroy it. What if there were only 40? For the sake of 40, I will not do it, he says. Lord, don't be angry with me, please. But what if there were only 30? And God says to him, if there were 30, I would not destroy the city. Now, Lord, forgive me again, but what if there were only 20? For the sake of 20, I think I said this before, I will not destroy it. Lord, don't be angry, but just one more time, just once more, let me go over this with you. If there were only 10, would you destroy the city? And he answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And then it says, he leaves, and Abraham goes back to his home. So we have this little interlude between the establishing of the covenant. The first time we see a covenant established with reciprocity. I will do this, and you will do this in return. And that reciprocity, I think is directly related to Abraham and Sarah's attempt to try to force the covenant to come into existence by their own means, with their own ingenuity, their own wherewithal, their own will, to compel the covenant to come into being. And so God establishes a term which I'm sure is sort of has a sort of a punitive effect, especially in the immediate term, but also serves to undermine the whole conception of the covenant as something which one can compel to come into being by natural means. The covenant is one of the promise and one of God's own divine act, not one of ordinary human passion. And then we get this little sidetrack now. Here we're moving away from the covenant and the promise, except that we're not. Because part of the covenant, or one of the tasks of the one who receives the covenant, is the task of priesthood. And one of the roles of priesthood is intercession. The one with whom the covenant is made is the father of the covenant and oversees it on behalf of his whole family, his whole clan. He has a duty to all the people in his household, to intercede for them, to protect them, to provide for them. And so we see here immediately a particular dimension of this covenant being brought out, which is the dimension of intercession. And in this, Abraham bargains with God. And he intercedes for the salvation of the whole city on behalf of his own family, even though they're not all part of the family. He could have just said, let me go down and get my family out. Let me go and save them, and then you do as you please. But he doesn't. He tries to intercede on behalf of the whole city. He tries to intercede on behalf of the wicked ones, that they would be saved for the sake of 10 righteous men. And you can be sure he's thinking, surely counting Lot and his sons and his family, I can find 10 there who are pleasing to God. In other words, he never meant it to be 50. But like a good Middle Eastern sheik, he knows how to haggle. And he's going to start out high, and he's going to bring it down to where he thinks he can get it. So there's something very human and very funny, but also profound and sweet happening here. That it reflects Abram's understanding of his own role as priest and as father of this family, and his own responsibility before God as the priest to intercede for them. So, now we... hi, everybody. let me just check in here real quick. Now we go over to 19. And we are moving on into Sodom and Gomorrah. And the story here is rather a sordid one. Two of the angels that were with Abraham have gone on to the city. Or two other angels go to the city. And they arrive in the evening. And Lot, presumably because he is someone of some importance in the town, or at least important enough to sit in the city gate with the men of the city, and because that's where you conduct business, that's where the old men sit and talk and the young men come and listen. So Lot is there sitting in the city gate when these strangers come into town. Lot, like his father, is concerned to show hospitality. And so he says to the men, men, please come and stay at my home for the evening. And they say, oh no, that's okay, no trouble. We'll just stay here in the city square. We'll make a tent here and camp here inside the walls, and that'll be fine for us. And Lot says, please come to my house for the night. Please come and stay with me. I beg you, sirs, don't stay here in the town square. Come and be in my home. We'll have a beautiful supper. I have a nice place. You'll be comfortable there. Please don't stay here. And it becomes clear in a few verses why Lot is so adamant that they not stay in the city square. So it says they go with him and they enter his house, and he prepares a meal for them, baking unleavened bread without yeast. And they eat. And here we see a little detail that is going to become connected to a much larger theme later. Bread without yeast. He bakes some unleavened cakes. Remember that. Before they had gone to bed, it says, all the men from every part of the city, young and old, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, where are the men who have come to your house? Send them out to us, so that we may have them. And here again, they mean this in the sexual sense. Lot goes outside to debate with the men, to argue with them, and he says, please don't do this. There are strangers here. That you can't do this. And he tries to make for them a trade. He offers them his own daughters. And we're all blanching at this point at the terribleness of all of this and the thought that they would offer them anything at all. There's something to the notion, the sense here of degrees of horror. In other words, as horrible as we can imagine it to be that they would take the girls, and they're not going to. Worse still, to take other men and strangers. And this goes back to the unnaturalness that we associate with Sodom from the time of the Nephilim, who come and mate with the women. There is something about unnaturalness, things that don't go together being put together for ill reason, that goes to the very essence of the broken taxis or order of creation that takes place, that we see manifest in the fall. It's the very undoing of the order that God created. And so it's not only barbarous, but blasphemous. Not only unnatural, but literally an attempt to undo the order, the connectedness, the integralness of God's creation as it was intended to be. So all of that plays into Lot's response here. And anyway, Lot's response shouldn't be construed as a good, and the angels are not going to allow it to happen anyway. he goes back into the house, and the angels basically say, you leave this to us, and they step out, and then pow, and everybody's blinded. And the men can't see where they're going, they can't see anything, they can't get in the house, they've been blinded. And the angels say to them, in the morning, you and all your family, you get out of here. You flee to the hills. You run and you don't come back. And this, of course, creates a fair amount of consternation. If somebody said to you, get out of here, leave Norfolk right now, and don't turn around and don't stop until you get to Roanoke. Your instinct is to say, well, I've got to go home and pack a bag, or let me get a few things. And they say, no, you have to go right now. You don't pack a bag, you don't pack your groceries, you don't clean out the fridge, you don't run down to your cousin's house and get your pet goldfish that you left there. You leave now. So they begin to run. And Lot and his wife and their family, and unfortunately, he goes to his sons-in-law, the husbands of his daughters, the ones who are married, not the ones who are still living in his house. And he tells them, the angels, the men who stayed with me have warned me that they're going to destroy the city, that God's anger has been turned against it, and we have to leave. And they're like, ha ha ha, you crazy old man, we're not coming with you. And so they stay. They don't come. Keep that in mind again for later. Because what you're seeing here is both a recapitulation of the story of Noah and a prefiguring of the flight from Egypt. In that sense, it echoes the one story a little bit, but also adds in some new things, like the unleavened bread, like the thinking it's a joke, like the wickedness, the unnaturalness of things, that both echo the old story, but also sew in some new details that you're going to see emerge in a more vivid way when we get to that story. So you see here how the continuity of the stories is being established. You have something that's very much in certain ways like the other story that came before it, but also adds in some new details, some new wrinkles that will be echoed by the story that comes after it. So in other words, if you were to take the story at the beginning and the story of the Exodus, you would find they're more different. But if you take in the stories that come between them, then you find that they're knitted together in this continuity, this thread that ties them all together as you go. Right? So, Lot and his family run, they flee, and then it says, fire rains down from heaven and destroys the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and there is nothing but ash that rises up. In the process, Lot's wife turns to look back. And this was one of the things the angel said not to do. And it says that she's turned to a pillar of salt. I don't really want to spend any time with that right now, because I want to get on to what happens next. So we have here a sort of in miniature, a destroying of the world. Like with, God looks down and sees the wickedness of the men, and he says to Noah, everybody's wicked everywhere, and I'm going to destroy it and start all over. He looks to Abraham and he says, Abraham, everything is wicked down there, I'm going to destroy it and start all over. And Abraham, because there is now this covenant that is reciprocal here, he has established a covenant in which he has responsibilities, unlike the Noah covenant, which is entirely on God's side. God calls him righteous, and he gives him this thing to do, but God's covenant is entirely, all he has to do is follow these rules. In this case, there is now a reciprocity here that has been established with God. So Abraham begins to bargain with God, don't do it, if I can find 10 righteous men. I want to restrain I want to preserve and save these people. So we see here an enhancing of the priestly vocation in the covenantal relationship. Well, then there is an unmaking of the world anyway. A remnant is saved out of this unmaking. And then it says they flee to a little town, or the hills outside of a little town, nearby Zoar, which I think means one where they flee. That's the name of the place you run to. They settled in the mountain, or on the hill, outside of the city. So here we are again, like Noah, whose boat comes to rest on the mountain. Here Lot is on the hill outside of the city. Now, Abraham was already on a hill, near a big oak tree. He's already on his little hill, again, echoing paradise all the way back. Lot is here, like Noah. And then something interesting in the sense of the scriptural narrative happens. Lot has daughters, and the daughters have no husbands. And they say, our father is old, and there's no man here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's go into our father and get him drunk and get pregnant by him. You should be thinking back to when Noah got drunk and he was laying there naked, and his one son came in and beheld his nakedness and went and saw and told his brothers. And then the other two brothers come in, and they walk him backwards, and they cover his nakedness, his shame. They clothe him again, as Adam and Eve were clothed again after they saw their nakedness and were ashamed in the garden. Robed, covered again, their feebleness, their vulnerability, their shame covered by the kindness of God. Noah's shame covered by the kindness of his sons, and when he wakes up, he curses the one son who becomes the father of the Canaanites, and he blesses the other two. Now, the daughters go in on consecutive nights. They do the same thing. They get him drunk. They sleep with him. He is unaware that this happens, which is remarkably strong wine or a remarkably weak constitution, one or the other. I don't know which. But it says then that their sons become the fathers of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Two nations in which the children of Israel after the Exodus will be in conflict with. So we see here an attempt to like with Abraham, they try to make something happen on their own terms, and problems will come from it later. They try to establish a covenant like is the custom throughout the earth, and trouble is going to come of that. Just like when the one son comes into his father and beholds his nakedness and goes out and tells his brothers that it becomes a problem later on. So we see here again the whole issue of nakedness and clothing, of human will and divine providence, divine power, the way people tend to want to make things happen, and the way God affects things to happen by His promises. We see the story of Adam and then Noah being recapitulated here with new dimensions that will be coming up in the story later on. Yes, sir.
Well, I'd never seen this before, and I don't mean anything irreverent by this, but it's kind of an I got you kind of thing where he offers his daughters to the men, and then later in the story, they kind of, I got you, they conceive sons. I've never noticed that before.
Yeah, there's a negative sort of reciprocity there. This is the working out in the opposite direction of that whole line of thinking. And it can be read in just that way. Like that was bad, and this is continuation of that bad line of thinking. it certainly shouldn't be read as this is a perfectly good and acceptable thing to do. And it's interesting, we tend to read the Old Testament from the perspective that the people we know or think of as the heroes, the good guys, that everything they say or do is right and good. And that, therefore, it legitimizes everything they say and do. And this takes us to some pretty uncomfortable places. But that's not the way you're supposed to read it. So you want to be careful about not reading it that way most of the time. So in other words, when you get to the Babylonian exile and you read, or you read that passage from the Psalms, blessed are you when the Israelites speaking to the Babylonians, blessed are you when they shall take your little ones and dash them against the stones. We tend to read that as though what Israel is saying is a good thing in and of itself. Like, yeah, you persecuted Israel, and it would be a good thing if someone smashed your little babies against the rocks. That's not the way you're supposed to read it. You are having a mirror held up for you of what happens, the dark places that you go to when you rebel against God. And when you turn away from Him, when you reject Him, when you will not listen to His prophets, when you will not keep His covenant, when you will not worship Him, when you go after other nations, this is the kind of ugliness that it leads you to a place where this is where you are, and this is the darkness of the place that you have come to. So Scripture is holding up for you a mirror, letting you see where you will go if you continue in this way. And if you don't like that, then you should probably come to your senses before you get there. So, moving on, in chapter 20 we find a repeat of the story of Abraham and Pharaoh, only this time it's Abraham and Abimelech, another king in the area, king of Gerar. And it's almost exactly like the story before, except with a little more detail, a little more of a blessing. And it's here that Abraham is given by Gerar land of his own, and to live wherever he wishes, which will be significant. I wanted to finish today, though, by talking about Genesis 21 and 22, specifically the birth of Isaac. In other words, that's my way of saying there are a lot of interesting things we can talk about, and I'm not going to talk about them all. As the angels had promised, about a year after the time when Sarah laughs, Isaac, which means laughter, is born. Much to their astonishment, this beautiful little baby. God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. One thinks ahead to the birth of the Baptist. The incredulity of Zechariah and Elizabeth, and the incredulity that is turned to joy. But Isaac is born, and Abraham and Sarah are thrilled. Animosity increases between Sarah and Isaac and Hagar and Ishmael, and they're sent away. God promises again to care for Hagar and Sarah, to bless them. Abraham asks that they would be blessed. And then, again, perhaps related to the whole dynamic with Hagar and Ishmael. We get to chapter 22. When Isaac is old enough to be strong, and he is probably 10, 12 years old, God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, the son of the promise, and go to the region of Moriah, and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. I cannot imagine what goes through Abraham's mind at that moment, except that his God is more like the other gods than he had imagined. Because in the land of Canaan, human sacrifice was not unknown, particularly, but perhaps not exclusively, with the god of Molech, for whom child sacrifice was the standard form. So Abraham gets up early the next morning with his donkey and 2 servants, and he loads up the firewood and everything that he needs, and off they go. Notice again that the sacrifice is to be offered on a mountain, a temple much like paradise. They reach the place, and Isaac or they reach the foot of the mountain. Abraham tells his servants to wait there, and he and Isaac will go on further and make the sacrifice. So they go on up the mountain, and when they get to the place, Abraham builds the altar and stacks up the wood. Where's the sacrifice? Isaac says. Isaac, he then puts on the table, and he gets his knife out, and he holds his knife up, and he is just about to strike, and God says, "Stop! Wait!" Grabs his hand from the heavens, as it were. And he says, "Stop!" And Abraham turns and looks, and there in a thicket, just a little ways from where he has built the altar, is a ram with his horns stuck. God says, "This is your sacrifice, not your son." Now, this is important, particularly because, as I have mentioned several times, this whole story and all of these stories come into being in dialogue with the religions of the world around them. The whole point of the Abraham and Isaac story is to emphatically undermine the difference between the God of Abraham and the God of the other nations. Because, as I mentioned last week, if this story exists in any of the other stories of the nations, they go up the mountain, Abraham kills his son, and then the rain comes and the crops grow again. That's the way this goes. But here it doesn't happen that way. So anybody who's listening to the retelling of this story of Abraham and Isaac is waiting for it to play out just as familiar as happens in the other. And you get to this point when God grabs his hand from heaven and says, "Stop!" and provides a ram as a sacrifice. And you, whoa! That is not how this story plays out. This God is doing something I didn't expect. This is different. This is not the way I was expecting this to happen. And so something really important is being said here. That the God of Abraham, the God of this covenant, does not accept human sacrifice. That he will provide for himself a sacrifice. So again, here we're looking back. We're in dialogue with what's gone before. That unlike the other nations, God does not accept human sacrifice. We're also sowing the imagery for something yet to come. God provides himself the sacrifice. God will provide for himself an acceptable sacrifice. And that's important for what's going to come ahead. So, the real thrust of the story here is to show how God does not accept human sacrifice. Of course, our tendency here is because we've made Abraham our hero, to say, "Oh, look at the great faith of Abraham. Look at his obedience." And there is a limited utility for that. But the real point here is to show how different God is from the God of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the other ites that live there. And that he will not accept human sacrifice. And that this is one of the things that distinguishes him, that sets him apart. And that sets Abraham and his covenant apart. So, God saves Isaac from the trajectory of the religion of the other nations. And Isaac then will become the father of Jacob. Jacob will become the father of the 12 patriarchs, who will become then a great nation. The promise will be fulfilled, but it will not be fulfilled in the land. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob will all die outside of the land of the promise. So we see here again, the covenant is renewed, the promises are renewed, there is reciprocity, there is priesthood, there is sacrifice and offering, but not the kind of sacrifice and offering that the nations had. There is intercession. But the curse is also still in effect. They have been cast out of paradise, and they will not find now paradise for themselves here. So the exile continues, even as the covenant is renewed and the promises begin to unfold. So we're still in that dialectic of promise and covenant and curse and exile that transpired at the very beginning of the story. And it will continue to unfold and play out as this recapitulation moves on. So, for all of you watching, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down. Send them in. Are there any other questions that you all had before we're done here? All right. God bless you.